Get ready to rumble. Schilling Show Unleashed on the Seven Thunders Media Network. Former city councilor, husband, father, and community watchdog. Your host, Rob Schilling.
Welcome to the Schilling Show Unleashed Podcast. Remember, your direct support makes our show possible, and you can directly support this podcast by visiting shillingshow.com and then clicking on the Patreon banner at the top of the page to make a monthly contribution. We appreciate your support. The Schilling Show Unleashed Podcast welcomes Jack R. Bailik, technology expert, a humanitarian, global innovator, and author of the new book, Lost in Time, Our Forgotten and Vanishing Knowledge. And Jack, thanks so much for joining us today on the Schilling Show Unleashed podcast.
Yeah, well, thank you for having me on, Rob.
You start out with a quote from Socrates, and it's, "I know that I know nothing." We've heard similar sayings in America growing up that, you know, when you get older, you realize how much you don't know. I'm assuming it's kind of the same concept, but let's talk about that as the premise for the vanishing knowledge.
Yeah, well, you know, when I put this book together, which took me about 10 years.
Wow.
A lot of research went into it. I thought about, you know, what was going on here. You know, a lot of times we think we know everything, or maybe we don't know everything, but we know the best. And it became apparent, you know, going through this, that we're just redoing what we've done before. You know, a lot of examples of things that we invented or we knew about and then we found again. So it's a realization, you know, it's kind of a realization that a little bit of humility maybe, that we may not know everything.
Yeah, I was thinking about the H words. Two came to mind: humility versus hubris, and this attitude that we have in some ways that we do know everything or that we're on top of all of this. But how do we bring ourselves as a society back down? I mean, because it's very hard to change human nature in this instance.
Well, the hope here is that awareness is a catalyst for change. Mm-hmm. And by being aware of some of these facts, of some of these surprising facts in many cases, it'll cause us to think about it and maybe change how we act.
There's a great example in the beginning of the book about Henry Ford's production line. Again, Henry Ford credited with that. And then we go back and take a look at China's Terracotta Army, which is a fascinating story in and of itself, but preceded Henry Ford by a long, long time. So how do we not put those two things together? You certainly did in your research, but why do we leave that out of a modern interpretation?
I think what happens is we see these tidbits and we just don't really think about it. I'll use the example of the ancient Roman vending machine. Mm-hmm. You know, Hero of Alexandria invented a vending machine in 10 BC in Rome. You know, that vending machine, you'd put a Roman coin in and it would dispense holy water at temples. And they even had a version that would send steam up out of it, and it would land on a image of an idol on a wall and make it look like it was crying in order to get more money. Things don't change much in 2,000 years. But the fact that was done, you know, you say, oh, wow, you know, that's interesting. That's pretty good. You know, if you start seeing this over and over again, you know, I also talk about cataract surgery, how we did that in 800 BC by a physician in India, Sushruta, and then even further back, 2400 BC, the ancient Egyptians there's evidence from the Ebers Papyrus that they did cataract surgery as well. We see these facts, we say, oh, that's interesting. Oh, that's interesting. But if you start taking a look at the big picture, you'll see that we just keep doing this over and over again, where we have some piece of knowledge, some piece of wisdom, and we lose it and then find it again.
Jack, I'm very curious about your research. I'm astounded and really quite interested in the fact that you spent 10 years in looking at all of this, which shows a very thoughtful approach. But tell us about what you were looking for when you were looking in? Did you find surprises along the way?
Well, that's kind of how it started.
Yeah.
I saw these facts and I said, oh, that's interesting. Oh, that's interesting. And I thought, well, I could just put together a compendium of interesting facts,
Yeah.
and that would probably be interesting all by itself. That was the impetus initially for the book. But, as I looked at it more and more, I said, wow, what's the point? Why are we, first of all, why are we doing this? And secondly, is there anything we can learn from it? The way you learn is by making mistakes. We seem to keep making the same mistake where we find something and then we lose it. I said, wow, well, what are we doing here? And at first, my first thought was, we're just keep letting, wars, we lose a lot of this information because of wars or maybe natural disasters or earthquakes or fires or floods, different sorts of things. But in reality, what's going on here is we keep losing knowledge because we don't care. We don't care to save it. And if we did, we would take steps that were appropriate to save it for future generations.
We have access instantly to information now, and I know, some people really get caught up in this. So they call it going down rabbit holes when they're on the internet. But there's really no long-term recall. And I think back to an example of my own childhood where I knew probably 20 or 30 phone numbers by heart, maybe many more than that. And today, someone else is doing it, and in technology is remembering the numbers for us, and we really have almost no long-term recall of anything. So we can get the information, but then it's like it goes in and out.
That brings up 2 points, actually. As we progress through time, we rely on remembering different sorts of information. Way back when the book was invented, all the scholars and philosophers of the time thought that was the end of the human race, the end of the human mind, because we wouldn't have to remember, anything. It would be in a book. Well, that's not what happened at all. And we might be able to remember in our lifetime where the calculator came out and was invented, and we thought, oh, there goes, that's the end of mathematics.
Yeah.
Kids won't have to remember how to multiply and divide anymore. Well, that's not what happened. And I'm thinking the same thing about AI now. Everybody might be thinking, oh, well, this is, our demise. But probably that's not what's going to happen. That's one part of it is that I think that's just our natural progression to be able to do things quicker and easier and help us to progress. But the other part of that story is the fact that, as we save this information, you're saying, well, we don't have to remember phone numbers. Well, there's other things we save, how we save our information on technology today on USB drives and SSD drives. And we don't really think about it. We don't really think about how long is that media going to last. The other day I wanted to take find some photos from a trip I took, and I had 8 USB drives, and these were a little older, I don't know, 5, 8 years old, something like that. I started looking through them, and 2 of the 8 USB drives wouldn't even work. I couldn't get any information off of them. And so, and we put stuff on our computers, we put stuff on DVD drives and CD drives. Those only have a lifetime of 30 or 40 years. And the pits oxidize and you can't read them anymore. The point is we just need to be thoughtful, about where we put things so it can be there for future generations.
Yeah, I have a friend who has a business where he does media transfer from old or forgotten formats. So people come across an 8-track tape or they come across an old home movie. And so he has all this legacy equipment where he can bring it into modern digital age. But really, things are changing so quickly. I remember things called zip drives that were a big deal about 20, 25 years ago. And then nobody even knows what that is anymore, and very hard if you have data there. So how do we handle this rapidly changing technology? Do we put everything back on paper and acid-free and lock it up somewhere?
Yeah. It's interesting. I interviewed the head curator at the Computer History Museum up near San Francisco.
Yeah.
And they have a bunch of these old XT computers, IBM original computers and Macs. They used floppy drives, to save their information. Those floppy drives, that media in there becomes brittle and cracks, and you can't use it anymore after a while. I don't even know if you can still buy them. But what they do is they take the computer programs and the information that was stored on there, and they print them on paper. What I was talking earlier about being thoughtful, when we save something, we need to be thoughtful about it. If you have a picture or a photo or, whatever, an email or something that you really want to save for a long time, think about where you're putting it. Do you want to print it out and keep a printed copy? Or do you want to put it in multiple places so you have redundant copies? So if the media fails, you have another way of maybe getting it. So it's just we just need to be thoughtful about where we put our information.
In preparing for this interview, Jack, I requested a hard copy of your book, and a lot of times people want to send out PDFs, and I despise reading a PDF on screen. I like lying down in my bed or sitting in a comfortable chair with a physical book in hand, and I would imagine that the experience and maybe even the retention is different as opposed to consuming from a digital source.
Yeah, everybody has a different way. I got a friend that loves to hear books,
Yes.
in audiobooks, and I personally I can't retain the information for whatever reason. If I listen to it, it just goes in one ear and out the other one.
Yeah.
So I think it is personal. Different people have different ways of learning and different ways of retaining information. But I'm like you. I like the book, and it's not going to go. There's a huge issue going on right now in the movie industry.
Yes.
I don't know if you heard about that, but yeah, where it's moving towards streaming media, and there's people who want the DVDs. They want the hard copy so they can watch it over again and so on. Here's an example. Are we doing the right thing? Are we thinking about this? Maybe the hard copy, maybe the DVD is better. We need to really pay attention to think about the future is the point. Think about the future.
I have kept all my CDs. I have a friend who had a 800 or 1,000 CD collection and was just giving it all away because it was more of a liability than an asset. But to the point of movies, we have VHS tapes still in the house as well as DVDs. My concern is that when they start streaming things exclusively, that they can make changes and edits and no one will ever know the difference. There are some scenes out of certain movies from bygone era that might be deemed offensive today, but I don't want that taken out. And I'm concerned that if we go to streaming, we'll never really know what we're missing because that all can be edited out or changed with technology.
Yeah. Without a doubt, that is a concern. And if we look back over history, you can see instances where people, usually politically, people want to change what people know. There's that Emperor Qin Shi, same one that built the mausoleum, the 7,000 terracotta warriors. He decided at one point that no one should have a library. And he said, if anybody is caught with a scroll or a book, that they would get tattooed on their forehead and sent to work on the Wall of China.
Wow.
And there's other examples in time where, people have burnt books and destroyed books just because of whatever their personal beliefs or their political purposes.
The Schilling Show Unleashed podcast continues with our guest, Jack Bailik, in just a moment.
Online at schillingshow.com.
ShillingShowMedia.com is your one-stop shop for websites, audio and video production, and photography.
ShillingShowMedia.com will take your project from conception to completion.
ShillingShowMedia.com is reasonably priced and highly professional.
Need a website for your business? Visit ShillingShowMedia.com.
Need a video created or edited? Visit ShillingShowMedia.com.
Have a photography or graphic design project? Visit ShillingShowMedia.com.
ShillingShowMedia.com is your one-stop shop for websites, audio and video production, and photography.
Visit ShillingShowMedia.com. That's ShillingShowMedia.com.
Get your fix. Schilling Show Unleashed.
We return now with Jack Bailik. The book is Lost in Time, Our Forgotten and Vanishing Knowledge. Jack Bailik is the author. I wanted to talk to you about the pyramids. This has long been a mystery, and this is an instance of what I would call a magnificent feat of engineering. Do we know, you mentioned in your book, do we know with authority now what happened and how those monstrous pyramids were built?
Yeah. Well, that is the elephant in the room.
Yeah.
A big elephant. My background, I did a lot of project management in my career. Mm-hmm. And I was just thinking about it from an engineering and a project standpoint. And I thought, wow, what are the numbers on this? What would we have to do? And I just did simple math. There's 2.3 million stones. Each stone is 5 to 7 tons each. They believe it was built over a 20-year period. So I just did the math and figured out you'd have to lay one stone every 2 minutes for 12 hours a day, 365 days a year for 20 years.
Wow.
That's astounding. That is incredible feat of work. How did they do that? Oh, by the way, they didn't have wheels and they didn't have pulleys. So yeah, they rolled all these blocks on, logs and used elephants. I don't see how that's even possible. I want to work on that some more and take a look at that, but it's amazing. So what technology did they have? How did they do that? Obviously they didn't need a wheel, they didn't have one. Yeah. They did it without it. It's just incredulous, but we don't have the actual documents. We don't have any written form of how they did it. So what we have is conjecture at this point.
Do we think that they wrote it down and the knowledge was lost, or was this not a culture that wrote those sorts of things down? Because again, it's such an amazing feat.
I mean, this is just my personal belief, is that it is likely that there is information somewhere that will tell us how they did it. There's so many examples over time where we've buried time capsules with information and then lost it. In particular, there's one famous one where George Washington buried a time capsule at the White House in 1793, and it's never been found. Maybe it was found last week when they were digging around over there. I haven't heard. But we think, I think there is some information, and it's probably buried someplace. And it's really safe. It was buried in a safe spot, So it's really hard to find. Someday, maybe we'll come across it and find it.
There is a discussion in your book, Jack, about time capsules, and I've always been fascinated. I remember when I was a kid watching one being buried, and then watching one some years later being dug up, and it was pretty much destroyed because whatever they had buried it in was not effective in keeping the earth out of it and the water out of it. So Time capsules are something that's been going on for a long time. You mentioned Washington. Were there examples of them from earlier civilizations?
There's many examples of time capsules that have been found. There's I don't know if they're time capsules, but libraries. We've found many libraries, like in the Babylonian area, in Babylonia, 2000 BC or earlier, and those libraries have cuneiform. We have experienced. We have found libraries. We have found time capsules. Information has been buried and found again. There's a famous library. Oglethorpe University has a crypt of civilization that they've put in their campus there. And they want that to be opened in the year 8113.
That's a long wait.
But yeah, it's a long way to save a time capsule. But, these are, is that going to help somebody in the future? We don't know, of course. Is it going to be there? We go around blowing things up or, all kinds of natural disasters. Could that happen here? It could, but time will tell.
You mentioned libraries, and there's a great section in the book about libraries. I wanted to talk about the Royal Library of Alexandria, which I had not heard of, but it sounds like there was a tremendous amount of information that was lost. Tell us about that.
The Library of Alexandria, well, that was one of the world's largest libraries in, I don't know, I want to say it started in early BCs through about 391 AD. They estimate it had some 400,000 scrolls in there. All kinds of information. They were religious texts and scholarly scrolls and texts and that sort of thing. And what happened was I believe it was the Roman Empire. The Romans said, hey, there's some religious scrolls in there. We don't like those. Let's go burn it down. So it was burned down in 391 AD. Yeah, most unfortunate. What if we had that information today? Did it to ourselves, so to speak.
I'd like to talk about the generational transmission of important knowledge. We had many cultures over the course of human history where knowledge was transmitted verbally because it didn't have the ability or the necessary tools or storage to write them down. Do we still have cultures like that, and is that a reliable way to transmit knowledge?
Knowledge travels on language. Whether that language is written down or whether it's oral, that's the way we save it, transmit it to the next generation. And there's many examples of that because, in the early days, people weren't educated as widely as they are today. And so knowing how to read something wasn't as much of an advantage. So orally, that's how information was transmitted. Of course, we know that, a lot of Indian cultures, American Indian, transmit stories down from one generation to another. And we find that a lot of that is done very well because they value the memories of the information that they have. But of course, you can lose that information just as easily, if those people's lost or absorbed or whatever, those traditions can get lost. But written information gets lost as well. But that is an effective way for knowledge to get transmitted.
You mentioned in the book about information overload, archiving things, and it seems to me we're generating so much content just through modern technology. We think about YouTube and we think about the social media, and this is overwhelming amounts of knowledge and overwhelming need to overload our systems and availability of storage. So how do we handle that? Do we just let it like water roll off our backs?
This is interesting because where I live in Arizona, they are building huge, these are gigantic data centers. They're a quarter of a mile long and wide. These are just massive. I thought they were building a car manufacturing plant when I saw one of these things. It was so big. But what we're doing is putting more and more of our information and knowledge into the cloud, which is basically just a data center. And we're relying on that to be effective in saving our information in the future. But, nature has a way, mankind has a way of doing things and making mistakes. We're just saving such massive amounts of information, these cloud storage. Now they have incredible backup systems that are being built around these places, but my thought was, hey, what if we had some kind of a natural disaster that was pretty rare? What if we had, say, a Carrington event? We had a Carrington event in the 1850s, and Carrington event is a large solar storm from the sun. It's a EMP, electromagnetic pulse, that comes from the sun. And if the sun happens to be pointed at the Earth at the time that solar flare occurs, it can cause a lot of damage. So the one in 1850, what happened there is we didn't have power. We didn't have electricity at that time. There were power poles and that sort of thing. But we did have telegraph poles and telegraph wires. And what happened is when that event occurred, it caused those wires to be energized and caused fires at the telegraph stations. And what would happen today if we had one of those? I mean, we are so connected, it would be, a huge mess, for us. And what would happen with those data centers? I just wonder.
Yeah, I think that's something to ponder, and I don't think the outcome would be too good. Jack Bailik, the book is Lost in Time, Our Forgotten and Vanishing Knowledge. If people want to get a copy of this book or get more information on the work you're doing online, tell us how, please.
Yeah, sure. Go to my website, lostintime.world. You can get more information there. Also, my books can be found on, Amazon, Barnes & Noble, or your local bookstore can order them as well. I can be seen occasionally on the podcast, The Soul Report.
The 10 years you spent putting this book together was well worth the time. It's fascinating. Jack Bailik, thanks for joining us today on the Schilling Show Unleashed podcast.
Yep. Thank you for having me on, Rob.
That concludes another edition of the Schilling Show Unleashed podcast. Visit us online at schillingshow.com, where you can directly support this podcast by clicking on the Patreon banner at the top of the page and making a monthly donation. Your support is essential for the continuation of the Schilling Show Unleashed podcast. Until next time,